Ladies and gentlemen, 54 years ago today, this man joined the Navy. Today, as part of a special presentation of his journey towards becoming an accredited speaker of Toastmasters International, I am privileged, and I believe you are privileged, to hear a special presentation, a story that will not only entertain you, but have a message for us all. Able Toastmaster Tom Ware draws from his life experiences, from being in the Navy, from his days in the civil aviation, and more recently in the New South Wales Police Force. Toastmaster Tom Ware has always impressed me with his skill as a storyteller, but his integrity in giving back to the community at any moment when he's asked. Ladies and gentlemen, with his special presentation tonight, to the memory of the 60 tellers, please welcome Tom Ware.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you very much for that warm welcome. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, they brought the blue metal from Shell Harbour to make the Sydney railways. They brought those massive pre-cut granite blocks from the south coast to make the Sydney Harbour Bridge. They brought black diamonds, the so-called smokeless coal from the Illawarra, which fed the furnaces, the powerhouses, the gasworks, the boilers of the big ships. For 100 years they plied the coast. And then they were gone, superseded, obsolete, of no further use. What were they? These were the 60 milers, the 60 milers. And why 60 miles? Because it was roughly 60 miles from Hexham, Newcastle, down the coast to Sydney Harbour. It was roughly 60 miles from the Illawarra up to Sydney Heads. These were not your QE2s and Queen Marys and great ocean liners, no. These were those tiny little coal-blackened ships of 500, 600, 700 tonnes, which seemed to scuttle into the harbour and nobody noticed them. But they were absolutely essential to this city in those early days, for without them we would have had no power, would have had no infrastructure at all. These were working ships, and they worked them all of their lives, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. They would load them up, right from the keel, right up to the gunnels, chock-a-block full of coal, and bring that coal into Sydney. And they used to use them until they were so old that they either sank or fell apart before being broken up. Hands up those of you who can remember a company called R.W. Miller. A few hands go up. The oldies, of course, R.W. Miller. A huge company, but now disappeared. When I was doing the research for this presentation, probably about 10 to 12 years ago, I looked up R.W. Miller in the phone book. Sure enough, they were there. They had an address at Circular Quay. So I dialed the number. Ring, 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 ring. Went on and on and on. And I thought, I must have the wrong number. Dialed it again. Same thing. Then I dialed Telstra. They said, no, there's something wrong there. That number should have been disconnected years ago. Well, you can imagine in the old phones when they could stick them in the cupboard, not like today's phones where there's 4 rings and before you can sort of step out of the shower it's gone on to answer. In the old days, the phone would ring forever. For 6 months, it'd keep going. Anyway, apparently the company had been taken over, merged with some big conglomerate somewhere. But way back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s, R.W. Miller was a huge company. They had their own coal mines, their own ships, of course, their own wharves. They had coal trucks. Anyone remember Britain's Brewery? Britain's Brewery? That's a long while back. Millers took them over. They had a brewery as well. But back in round about the late 1920s, they had a ship built called the Annie M. Miller. The Annie M. Miller was built in Scotland, sailed out here. It lasted 6 months. Went down off the coast, 6 drowned, 6 rescued. They needed another ship. And so they decided to have this one built in Scotland too. It was built in Aberdeen. It weighed 640 tonnes, was 165 feet long, with a crew of 14. And immediately they put it to work on the Hexham to Sydney run. This would have been 1930. And it worked day in, day out. Along came World War II, and they sent the ship up to Darwin. Now what they would do in those days, they'd put about a 6-pounder gun up forward, put some people from the Grey Funnel Line, which was the organisation I was in, the Navy, on board, and see out the war. Well, the ship survived the war and came back to Sydney and was put back on the coal run. At that time, a man by the name of David Walton joined the ship. And he stayed on it from 46 to 1948. And then, because he was an older man, what you've got to remember with these coastal ships, most of the crew were middle-aged men. They weren't you young fellas at all. And most of them wanted to be near the family. And that's why they sailed in these coastal vessels, so they could be home every night, see the grandkids grow up, this sort of thing. Well, David Walton had decided he would get a job as a marine surveyor. What does a marine surveyor do? Well, they check for the safety of ships. You can see them clambering around in the bilges with a torch or a lantern, looking at the rust, chipping away, saying whether or not the ship is good for another year, a bit like car registrations. Is it good for another year? Well, the Birchgrove Park was the name of this ship, and the Birchgrove Park was already getting pretty old, because the smaller the ship, generally, the smaller the ship, the quicker they rust out. Steel ships start to rust the moment they hit the water. And of course, when there's coal poured into the hold, they rust even quicker. David Walton was out to dinner one night when he was overheard saying to his wife, "Look, I don't know what's happening about this Birchgrove Park, but somebody or other keeps giving it a certificate of seaworthiness. The thing's a rust bucket. It's an accident waiting to happen." But of course, the ship continued to be re-registered year after year. After 7 or 8 years, David Walton, he got fed up of clambering around in the bilges of ships, bruising his knees and hitting his head. So he decided, he said, "Mum, I want to go back to sea again." "Oh, you can't do that. I want to go back to sea, and I want to go back on a coastal vessel." "Well, they're hard to come by, dear, now. You'll have to take what you're given." Well, he did get a berth on a ship, first mate. Guess what the name of the ship was? The Birchgrove Park. He was back on the rust bucket that he condemned in his mind many times. Well, the Birchgrove Park was making her umpteenth trip up the coast to Newcastle. As she came abreast Nobby's Head, the light flickered, and they flicked the lantern back, and they proceeded up the winding river under the bridge at Hexham. Anyone here remember the iron bridge at Hexham? It's still there. The iron bridge. As they went under there, they lowered the long wire aerial strung out between the two masts, the radio aerial, to facilitate the easier loading of the coal, because what happens, they open up the hatch and they pour the coal in on chutes, just rumble, 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 fills it up, fills it up. And this is what they were doing. They were filling up the ship, and as it filled up, a little mountain of coal sort of poked above the main hatch. Let me give you an idea what that main hatch would have looked like. It would have stretched from this stage here, probably right down to the end of that wall. It would have been about as wide as from where you're sitting here to about here. And that was all filled with coal, an enormous amount of coal. The sailors would then get in with their long-handled shovels, shovel it all around until it was just below the coaming level. And then they would put on the hatches, what they call batten down the hatches. It was August 1956, a cold winter. The captain was a man named Lawrence Lynch. He was about 64, 65, getting very close to retirement, and a very, very experienced sailor. It was said that he'd run away to sea at the age of 12, joined a square-rigged sailing ship as a cabin boy, sailed around Cape Horn numerous times, and he was a real sailor man, tons of experience. But he'd worked his way up to be a captain, the ship's master. Now, the Merchant Marine is very different from the Royal Australian Navy. The Merchant Marine is there to make money for the owners of the company, the shareholders. The captain of the ship, Lawrence Lynch, was aware of that. And he knew that the quicker they could turn the ship around in harbour, the more money the company would make. And there was a certain amount of pressure on them to do this sort of thing, much as there is on the interstate drivers now to make the distance in certain times. We all know that if you've got a great big 42-wheeler truck sitting in a garage, having some maintenance done, it's not making any money. Likewise, if you've got a great big Boeing 747 in a hangar, not moving passengers, it's losing money, it's not making money. Same with the colliers. So the captain thought to himself, all right, I've got a weather forecast here. The weather's been fine and beautiful for days now. Big high over Australia, right like it is now. Blue skies every day. And the weather forecast says, the Weather Bureau says, that the weather's going to remain fine for at least the next 12 hours. Okay. So bearing that in mind, he decided that instead of putting on the heavy winter weight tarpaulins, if you can imagine 4 huge canvases, almost as big as this room is long and 2/3 as wide, they've got to go over the hatch. They're very heavy, they're about 1 inch thick. And you can imagine the work of 5 or 6 men trying to pull those across, tighten them down, and then bang in the pegs to batten down the hatches. So first of all, they put across these great big heavy planks all the way across. And then the captain says, well, put the summer weight tarps on. We'll get away much quicker with the summer weight tarps. The summer tarpaulins were much smaller, much thinner in gauge, and there was only 2 of them. They would put one from one end, stretch it 2/3 of the way across, one from the other end, stretch that across the top, and then bang in the pegs and make it nice and tight. This is what they did. The captain then went up onto the bridge of the ship. Now remember, the bridge is down aft, right at the back of the ship. He looks at the trim of the vessel, and he notices there's a bit of a list to one side. It's down about 1 degree. He's happy with that. All right, let's go for it. She backs out into the river, and before you know, steaming down the river, this way and that. As it gets to the heads, the light flickers. You have permission to proceed. This is all the sort of formality they had in those days. And the ship then goes straight out to sea. The sea is calm, but there's been thin wisps of cirrus curling over the sky from early morning. And they've sort of spread out to become a spider's web of dust, which has now descended, and it's becoming quite grey. The ship then turns to the south. She hadn't gone 3 miles. The Weather Bureau were wrong. The captain out on the wing of the bridge felt that first puff of cold air wafting across the water, just a puff. And he knew a change was on the way. The smooth water, a few ripples. The ripples became wavelets. The wavelets became waves. And then, boom, down she went, shuddering for every rusty rivet. Up she come, boom, water over the bow, lee rail under, and they could hear that moan that started through the mast and funnel, say, which gradually got louder and louder, became a whine and eventually a shriek as they proceeded south. They weren't going into a southerly bust, it was just moving through. No. They'd entered a great cyclonic depression which had formed off the coast. The wind was backing around to the east, and this was going to be one of the worst storms in Sydney's in the history of New South Wales. But to the sailors, it was all routine. They'd done it 100 times before. Down below, a few of them had been playing cards. And as they proceeded down the coast, boom, up over the water, decks awash, lee rail under. They weren't worried about that. The ship was sound, or so they thought. Now, these colliers were so low in the water that their decks were perpetually awash when there was heavy weather. The lee rail, the side away from the wind, was always right under water. But, as I said, they felt they were safe. I was on a little ship in those days myself. It was called HMAS Kookaburra. It was 540 tonnes, smaller than the Birchgrove Park. And when we went out to sea, because we had modifications done to the superstructure, which should never have been done, we always had the lee rail under. The decks were always awash. But we were safe as houses because we were a warship. A warship is honeycombed with watertight compartments. There are dozens or hundreds of compartments, all with watertight doors and hatches. 3 or 4 of them could be sprung and the ship could still carry on. But a collier, a coal ship's not like that. A collier has one great big hold, as I said, length of this room, just one big opening. Behind that, they have the engine room and the boiler room compartment. And apart from a few cabins for the crew, that's it. If any of these major openings get breached, they're in trouble. So as they proceeded down the south, the ship taking a terrific battering, on the wheel was a man named Neil Stewart, quite an experienced sailor. As he was standing there, the ship, watching the lubber line as they steer this way and then that way and then this way, keeping it going, he said, "Captain, sir, she don't seem to be answering to the helm right. There's something not quite right." The captain said, Here, Stuart, let me take it over." And as soon as the captain puts his big freckle hands on that wheel, he knew immediately, just by the feel of it, that there was tons and tons of water already in the ship. "All hands on deck," he said, "all hands on deck." Well, the few that were available, probably 5 or 6 men, hurried up on deck. By now, the hatch covers were flapping, cracking wildly in the wind. And, of course, this is where he thought the water was getting in. He thought it was leaching down through the hatches, in amongst the interspecies between the coal and going down. Remember, the coal is wedged in tight. It's not going to shift. You hear about shifting cargoes, but this cargo won't shift because it's wedged tight. But there's a lot of space in there between the coals where they fit for the water to get in. There's already tons of water below. But after a while, they managed to pull the hatch covers tight again, bang in the pegs, and they repair below. By now, the sun has now gone down over the land to the west, and they can see the light of Barrenjoey Lighthouse scudding across the base of this cloud. The rain is pouring in at about 45-degree angle, lashing down on the ship, and the seas are tremendous. Down below, a man by the name of Earl Olson, senior fireman, is keeping the ship's boiler alive, keeping the engines alive. You can imagine what a hellhole it would have been. Down there in this little space, getting rocking around this way and rocking around that way. He puts the long handle shovel into the bunker, opens the furnace door. You can see the red blaze of the furnace. He puts in the coal. He clanks it shut again. Then he opens it more in. Of course, there's a bit of an art to stoking a furnace like that. As he's doing it again, he looks down. He can't believe it. In the reflection of the fire from the furnace is a grating, and beneath the grating he can see something flickering. Goodness gracious, it's water! We got water in the stokehole! He gets on the voice pipe. Captain, sir, Captain, we got about 6 feet of water in the stokehole. Now the captain realised that there was something dreadfully amiss, because the ship had been getting heavier and heavier. As it proceeded south, as it would go into a swell, boom, it would come up, groaning, straining under this enormous weight of water. And it was getting heavier and heavier. Now it was so low in the water that that little list that had 1 degree, you've heard of those things, you know those things that look like hockey sticks, like hollow hockey sticks, they're air vents. They're called goosenecks. The one on the front, port side, was now so low in the water that when they dipped forward, it was actually scooping water out of the sea right into the forepeak of the ship. They were in a desperate situation. But what they didn't know is that on the deck of the ship, there was a housing which ran the whole length of the ship, square housing made of steel, which housed a steam pipe. That was so rusty that a huge wave had come over and swept away about 10 feet of it. So every time the water came over, it was going straight into the ship. The ship, of course, was finished. Lower and lower into the water it went. The captain thought to himself, shall I make a break for it and go into Broken Bay? But even as he was thinking that, a huge gust of wind hit the ship, sending it right over on one side, and it stayed there. The wind just held it over. The noise of the wind, if you've ever been in a typhoon, it goes up and up in pitch, and still suddenly it sort of goes out of